Very good evening, sir. On behalf of the Legal Aid and Awareness Committee at NUJ Jodhpur, we are delighted to welcome you to this special session of our Darpan interview. My name is Kashish Saxena. We have with us Kairav Shah, Lavanya Adi, and a convener of the Legal Aid Committee with us today. So before we move any forward, I would just like to acknowledge that this meeting is being currently recorded. And if you have any objections to the same, we can stop it at any point of time.
Fine. Go ahead.
All right.
We don't have to make it so formal. Be yourself.
Of course, sir. All right, so before we move forward, I would like to invite Lavanya Di to talk something about the Darpan initiative that we have taken with us.
Sure.
Hello, sir. Good evening. It is an honor to have you with us, sir, today. Darpan ke baare mein, sir, to tell you a bit about our initiative, Darpan, which means mirror in English. It is a platform that we are trying to build under the Legal Aid and Awareness Committee of NLU Jodhpur. And what we are trying to aim is to highlight ground realities and the societal circumstances through the lens of law students who are engaged in the work of legal aid and awareness. So we are trying, basically our initiative focuses on bridging the gap between legislative intent and actual implementation, showcasing real stories and featuring expert insights and other multimedia approaches towards it. So, sir, today's conversation with you will not only enlighten us with your invaluable experiences and perspectives, but also further the objectives of Darpan by providing a deeper understanding of the practical realities of legal and policy framework. We are particularly excited to hear your insights on the gaps between policy intention, policy implementation, the interplay between societal norms and laws, the critical role of policy research in legislative reforms. So, as law students, we are keen on making that societal impact by being a part of the Legal Aid and Awareness Committee in our college. So, we are looking forward to your guidance on how we can contribute to policy research and advocacy. So, firstly, sir, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. So, you want to ask me some specific questions? I think that would be
Yes,
the best.
sir. We'll be beginning with the questions.
Yeah,
Over to you, Kairav.
Yeah, thank you. So, sir, moving on to the first question. In your experience while working in Vidhi, what do you see are the biggest gaps between the government's policy intentions and its actual implementation? And in addition to that, where do you think Vidhi plays a role in bridging the gap between both of them?
Yeah, so I think this actually has a fairly straightforward answer because which is difficult in this sector. But I think if you were to, there are many gaps, but if you were to ask me what the biggest gap is between ideas and their implementation is that we don't focus on designing our enforcement mechanisms when writing our laws and policies. Okay. And if we were to look at a couple of basic examples, you'll see a lot of laws use the word appropriate government, central government, state government. Okay. And this is littered. We are all law students, as we all know this. So, but the point is, who is going to exercise these powers? If you ask the draftsman, they'll say, there are allocation of business rules. So we will know by those rules who. He's right. From a draftsman's perspective, he's right. Okay. But if you actually look at it, you'll see a lot of the powers that are left to the state government are handled by the district magistrate. A lot of the powers that are left to the central government are handled by someone at the deputy secretary level in that relevant ministry. Now, somebody has to do that exercise that before this task is given to this person, is this the 7th responsibility on the person, the 70th responsibility on the person, or the 700th responsibility on the person? Nobody knows this. Nobody has a clue. Okay. And that is because we don't factor in our capability and capacity to enforce laws when we are writing them. And this is the biggest reason as to why we now say that, we have enough laws, but they are not implemented. This is the biggest reason. It's because when you're thinking about it, you're not thinking about it from an implementation point of view. Okay. So I think that's number one, is that we have to think about designing implementational mechanisms in a scientific manner, taking into account existing capacity and availability of capacity, right at the time when we are drafting the law or the policy. That's number one. Number two, which is another critical head, and as law students, I certainly, when I was in law school, I never even looked at this. But you'll see at the end of every law, and it's not there in our Universal Bare Acts, but it's there in actually the India Code law, that version that is passed by Parliament. There is a financial memorandum, right? Which is how much money is it going to cost in order to actually run this show. Now, if you see this, I'm taking an example. If you see these recent criminal legislations, okay, this Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita and so on, you'll see the financial memorandum says that, there is already an existing law. This is replacing that law with a new one. It is not estimated to have any financial implications. So just think about it. You have changed the entire criminal law of this country. Okay. Won't you have to, at the very least, do retraining of your police force? Okay, in this new law. अब जो 420 लगाते थे वो 420 अभी है नहीं, वो 316 है. किसी को तो बोलना पड़ेगा उन्हें ना, नहीं तो वो तो 420 ही लगाते रहेंगे. So the thing is that, but how will that happen? He will not magically know, and he'll not magically start reading a textbook and come to this conclusion, right? Someone has to do some training. That training, if you're talking about a police force in 665 districts, even if we assume there are 10 policemen in every district, you're talking about 6,000 policemen, you're doing some training program. कुछ तो पैसे लगेंगे. Okay. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. You need a lot more, because you have said all these things about electronic evidence, this, that, and the other. How will this happen? And this is, I'm not singling this out as an example, but this is actually a symptom of a larger problem, is that we don't factor in a budgetary analysis at a time when we are drafting laws. Because enforcement of laws takes money. And this actually, I mean, this is a realization that I only had in the last 4 or 5 years of my working life, not even at the beginning of Vidhi, certainly not at the time I was in law school or that I was teaching law. Because this is the kind of perspective you don't have. Okay. But the point is that enforcing laws takes money. That money has to come from an allocation. Allocations are made annually in the budget. But when there is a new law that is passed which has not been foreseen or envisaged, then where is that money going to come from? There must be an allocation that is made to every law, and that allocation must be based on evidence that this is what I think it will take to implement this law. So these are the two things that I think are the biggest gaps, is that we don't think about capacity to implement when we are writing the law. लिख देते हैं, हजारों चीज लिख देते हैं, पर फायदा क्या है? And second is that we don't, it's related but slightly different, but we don't think about how much money this will take.
All right, thank you so much, sir. So our second question pertains a little towards the community. There is a interplay between societal norms and the law, right? So from your perspective, is it the society that shapes the laws more, or is there a greater role in societal norms that molds the law? Like, how do you think this dynamic influences your work at Vidhi?
Yeah, so this is I mean, there is no easy answer to this, because, I mean, going back to Roscoe Pound, law is an instrument of social engineering. So law obviously has always been seen as a way in which it molds society, but it also has to develop out of social mores, and it cannot be completely divorced from it. So it can sometimes be ahead of society, but at the same time, it cannot be so ahead of society that it will not be accepted. So I think that it cuts both ways. So if we were to take an example, and a good example of this would be the recent judgment of the Supreme Court in Suprio. Now, right or wrong on that, the legalities of the judgment is a very different issue. Okay, and perhaps, I mean, as a constitutional lawyer, on the discrimination point, I think the judgment is wrong. Okay, as a legal matter. But having said that, this was also would have been, if the judgment went the other way, would have been an example where the law would have marched well ahead of where society is at this point of time. Okay, I mean, whatever, like it, dislike it, you may not like your society, that's a different matter. But at this point of time, as in largely speaking, society is not prepared to accept marriage amongst homosexuals. They're not prepared to accept it. Now, maybe you will say that is why you need courts and so on. Yes, that is right. But to a certain extent, okay, now if today, and I'm going to give you some ridiculous example, but it may, you never know, as in something might like this might happen in 200 years into the future, that some human being may want to marry an animal, right? It may happen. Okay. So it may sound like an absurd example today, but I mean, if someone 200 years back had said as a man, they want to marry another man, they would have thought it was similarly absurd at that point of time. right? So the point is that if someone wants to do that today, I mean, it will strike us as absurd. So if there was a law that could say that, then no one will say that. No one will ever even think of making a law like this, right? Because it sounds so absurd. So society and laws have always got to go in lockstep with each other. Law has a function of driving society in a direction of progressivism, in a direction of constitutionalism, in a direction that furthers the constitutional values of justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. I think law does have that function. But at the end of the day, the law cannot march too far ahead of society, and it never does, because at the end of the day, the law is made by the people, and there is a general sense, as in if you're generally a believer in the representativeness of liberal democracy, then there is a general sense in which democratic institutions represent the people, and so the law, as it always, moves in kind of lockstep with society. So I would say that it's hard to say that it's one way or the other, but I think both have to move in tandem for a law actually to be accepted and implemented. And I think this is another key point, is that you can make a law. I mean, even if there's and this is perhaps even more applicable to courts, you can interpret the law in a particular way that you think is very progressive and moves everyone ahead, and that's a good thing. But if it is so outlandish, then you know again that it will not be observed on the ground. Okay, no matter what you say in the judgment, as in it will actually not be implemented in that way on the ground. So I think it's important for both to move in tandem with each other.
So I just had a question regarding this. So when you think of reformations and drafting policies regarding that, how do you promote, like how do you employ strategies that would promote legal reforms, which might be a bit ahead of the societal acceptance? Like you must have to understand the societal norms better for it. So like how do you try to gauge what would be the societal norm? Because there has to be a lot of resources and exposure there.
Sure. I think this is a good question. I think the first thing, before I get to how we gauge it, is that the first thing that you must realize is that passing any law takes time. Okay. So don't ever think that something can happen in and out in 1 year, 2 years. Certainly can't. Like even simple legislations where there is widespread acceptability that we need something like this. And I'm taking an example from the economic sphere because they are less politicized. Say the insolvency and bankruptcy code. Okay. And no one will say that it's a bad, but it takes 3 years. It took 3 years. Okay. From start to it getting passed. Because I mean, there are a number of reasons. I don't want to get into that. But the short point is that it takes time. Okay. And second is that if you want to change, if you're proposing something that you think is a law that is a little bit ahead of where society is, I think the first step is simply first to get a sense, where is society? Because everyone may have a view on the issue. So let's take an example. Drug abuse is a major problem in Punjab. Okay, Punjab is a state that's ridden with drugs. So the first thing to understand is, where does society stand on this, given the fact that the NDPS Act has such large-scale penalties and offences, in the large-scale penalties for offences? Where does society stand in relation to criminalization of drugs? So the first thing to do is to do a very basic survey to try and understand this. As you said, as if you want to do something too elaborate, I mean, that also costs a lot of resources. But first you must understand where it is that you are. Okay. And we did that. And we actually were pleasantly surprised because we found that there is a lot of social ostracization for drug use. But people generally don't think of drug users as criminals. They think of people ki ye bigre hue hain. They don't necessarily say ki ye, the way in which they say that ye, in that sense, that they are hardened criminals. Okay. So they feel like they have lost their way. Okay. So that's the first thing. Then what you do is that for us, and this is how we have functioned as Vidhi, as in first we do some in-depth research to show the extent of the problem, diagnose where it exists. Equally critical is provide a solution. Okay. And the solution is usually in the form of an actual draft. Because until and unless you're talking concretely in terms of something that can be passed, something that can be actioned, सब बोलेंगे हाँ ये तो बहुत बढ़िया है आप कीजिए because it's all kind of at that level that doesn't require engagement. So the thing is that you have to create an action-oriented document. Okay, that is that progressive law or whatever. What in our case it was a it was a statute that decriminalized small quantities of drug usage. Okay, and we had an incremental way in which we suggested it. The second is that you need to identify, especially for things that are still a little bit ahead of the time, and ahead of the time could either be that society is not fully ready for it, or politicians may not be ready for it. Because actually with drugs, while we found that in society, people are kind of okay if we were to do some decriminalization. Politicians want to be seen as tough on crime. And when they want to be seen as tough on crime, decriminalization is seen as antithetical to that. So then what you need is you need an internal champion. You need to have someone in a position of power, either a politician or a bureaucrat, who sees things in your way. Or you have to convince them to see things in your way. And the third thing is large-scale advocacy in the ecosystem. Because the ecosystem of this drugs in Punjab is essentially police officers, is essentially politicians, is public health facilities, particularly de-addiction centers, NGOs who working with nasheris. So there's a whole ecosystem around that, and you have to work with the ecosystem to sensitize them that this is going to happen, because a law is not passed in the ether. ठीक है, ऐसे law बना दोगे तो कोई फायदा नहीं. The third and final point is that there has to be buy-in from everybody. We can never say, and if you see, or at least we at Vidhi, when we work on a law, we never say that we have drafted a law. We say we have assisted in the drafting of a law, because it is always a collective exercise. Okay, idea किसी से आया होगा, but ये करने के लिए ये हजारों लोगों की इसमें भूमिका है. So the thing is that very clearly that this is a collective exercise, and everyone must feel that they have a buy-in into the process. So when you are doing legal aid and awareness, it's not as if the person you are providing aid to should be seen as a passive recipient of advice. The person you are providing aid to is an active stakeholder in the justice system, where they have a role, you have a role, the judge has a role, and everyone else in the system has a role. That they think कि हाँ ये idea, ये विधि का idea है जो हम कर रहे हैं, ऐसे नहीं, ये हमारा idea है, ये सबका idea है. That is when ideas actually take root. So this is how we typically go.
All right. So you mentioned that you have to engage with the institutions and the stakeholders, right? So when you go about these engagement with advocacies or lawmakers, then there is often you see a resistance in them, right? Or it's but for non-corporate
Yes.
environment sometimes. How does Vidhi tackle these strategies?
Yeah, resistance is part of it. Okay, resistance is part of it. And our principles on this are very clear, that we will work with anyone who wants change. Okay. And the point is that we will not, and we will engage with everybody as long as they also are engaging in good faith. So that's the first point. Okay. Secondly, when there is actual resistance, I think there are two parts to it. One is to figure out as to whether there is disagreement that is based on some substantive point. And in many cases there are. So because at the end of the day, there will be people who have worked on this also for many, many years. Okay. And they may have very well held views. So if it is based on substantive points, you try and engage with that resistance, and you try and see, because of all range of extraneous factors. Right. And then in those cases, you have to bide your time. Okay. And this has happened in a whole range of issues. Like we've assisted in working on the Aadhaar Act. The Aadhaar Act had a lot of resistance right at the outset in terms of the fact that this is going to be privacy violating and so on and so forth. But the fact is that we work with as much as we can, and it's not as if I am drafting the Aadhaar Act. I'm providing input. And the point is that, there's, again, as I said, I think I said it in your college only, that I can't remember where I said it, that, these laws are not perfect. Okay, they never are. They're always a work that is tending towards perfection. You have to there is no finish line. It keeps changing. It keeps evolving. So if there is someone who's pointing out as something, that it can only help your law being better. Now, the only problem is that resistance at that moment can lead to anger. Like you can get upset and you can get angry, and it depends a little bit on good faith. But I think overall, in our experience as in resistance, once you've gotten over that initial feeling upset, that resistance can only help your work improve.
Thank you, sir. So in light of this, what you said, the challenges that you mentioned, what do you think that Vidhi has encountered in this journey towards making the impact on policy reforms and legislations? Along with that, what parameters do you use at Vidhi to measure your success? In the sense, how do you know that you were able to successfully navigate through a challenge and that reflected in the reform itself?
Yeah, so we have a twofold definition of impact. One is shaping the public narrative, and two is actually assisting in drafting of a law. Okay. So sorry, I think it's called bringing about legal reform. So shaping the public narrative and bringing about legal reform are the two overall dimensions of impact that we are looking to achieve with whatever project we are doing. Now, each of these has many sub-metrics. So bringing about legal reform will have some sub-metrics in terms of, have we been engaged by governments to draft this law? Has this law been passed? If passed, then how many people are likely to benefit from this law? Whatever. There are some kind of metrics on which we assess ourselves. Same for shaping the public narrative. So this is how this assessment is done, okay, in terms of whether we are making, and we don't measure it in terms of micro, in terms of one particular meeting or one particular issue, how it was resolved. We measure it in terms of particular projects. So every project, we have a project lifecycle form that is filled up, and we measure impact on that on these two broad metrics.
Right. So going on a slightly personal note, your journey on establishing the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, what was your inspiration? Could you share some insights on your journey to delve into law and policy research and address these very specific gaps in our landscape?
Yeah, see, as at that point of time, as I graduated in 2008 from undergrad. At that point of time, there were not that many options in terms as many as you have today. I'm guessing you'll say the same thing 15 years later. But the point is that we, broadly speaking, as in there were three options. There was litigation, there was law firm, and there was academia. And I was teaching law in Oxford, and I was quite clear that I wanted to come back to India. And I was going to litigate because that was a kind of set career option. But I'd always had a desire to want to do something that makes change at scale. Okay, and litigation is great, and particularly, I mean, with PIL and so on, you can make it at some scale. But litigation is still kind of downstream, right? You wait for a problem to arise, and then you come in, you're helping someone. So the direct impact of it is high in terms of the fact that you are seeing the person you're working with, you're improving their lives if something positive happens. But the overall macro impact in that case sense is fairly limited. So the idea was that can we do something that is at a level of scale? And so whenever we think of scale, as we think of lawmaking, and here there is something that I always found very baffling, that in our law schools, as in we only study judgments, right? We never really study how laws are made. Why don't we do that? Right? I always found that strange. That even if you're looking at, I mean, anything, you pick up any statute, you Transfer of Property Act, right? When you take Transfer of Property Act, there'll be, you'll do, 100, or you'll read the commentaries, which are basically interpretations of case law of these sections. But why was this provision like this? No one asked that question. And I felt that was strange. As lawyers, I think the first thing we should know is why something is the way it is. And there's a beautiful quote from Lord Bingham, who was the Chief Justice of the UK. He said, a lawyer without a knowledge of history is like a mechanic, and a very poor one at that. Okay, because you have to know as to where this came from, where something came from, what is the context in which it arose. Okay, and only then will you be able to understand what it was trying to do, and then be able to give advice to your client or whatever else it is. So the idea behind Vidhi was a simple one, is that let's try and understand and write better laws for India. And we're fortunate at that point in time that we found a little bit of support to be able to do it, both amongst my peer group as well as amongst people who were both within government as well as in the funding ecosystem, who were interested in backing it. And so that's how it started. And I think that I was pretty sure that there was always a need for something like this. And I'm glad that it has taken off some shape that we can all be proud of.
So, sir, I understand that there are a lot of people who are into research, who want to assist in legal reforms, who want to bring legal reforms at some level or the other, and there are a lot of stakeholders also which are involved. So there has to be some practical aspect as to ensuring how that research that Vidhi does, or when not just Vidhi, but anyone who does that research who they think is good enough, just doesn't remain on paper. Like there must be some practical aspect as to your engagement with lawmakers and advocates in general, so that there is a significant policy change, or there must be some opposition or resistance sometimes from the lawmakers or the stakeholders, even when you have accounted for all the stakeholders while drafting or assisting in the drafting of the laws. So how do you tackle that? How does that networking takes place to make those research effective enough?
Yeah, so the first thing is that, see, there is no research that is effective unless it is coming from ground up. Okay, and this is where I think, as in what you guys are doing with your legal aid and awarenesses, and that's critical, because at the end of the day, whether a law is needed, not needed, needs to be amended, doesn't need to be amended, all comes from ground level understanding of how it is operating. So that is both in terms of who the stakeholders of justice are, as well as particularly lawyers who are working with these cases on an everyday basis. They are seeing as to what's happening well, not well, etc., etc. Okay, so the first thing is that, and that is why the more that it is consultative and participatory, because the fact is that you cannot, as any expert organization, you cannot sit and you cannot make laws thinking that you know better. End of the day, and you put your theoretical position forward that this is what, like, take this data protection example, right? What we did with that as part of the Sri Krishna committee, we put forward a white paper in terms of that this is what we think is needed. But after that, we did 5 consultations in 5 cities. So the point is that what happens then? That's when you're essentially trying to get people's responses, and so that we know that you get the accurate response from various quarters. So I think this is the most important part in terms of making sure that the lawmaking exercise is consultative and participatory. That's one. Secondly, I think it's also about building up a sense of trust and expertise. I mean, I think over 10 years, and we've had to build that up, and this is true for many others as well. Like, I don't know, your very analogous example is that if you were to go today, you had a case and you went to Harish Salve, and Harish Salve said something. you would take it at face value, right? You would take it at face value. You won't go and see, ki, "Oh, let me check the textbook as to whether he's right or wrong." You would take it at face value because, he's built up that reputation and that expertise over so many years. And I think this is the second part, that, when you're doing any piece of work, is the fact is that you must have a reputation of absolute integrity and expertise. And that will happen over time. And this is what we have felt as well. We are still growing in a young organization. But our effort has always been to show to people that we have complete integrity and we give independent legal research. And if you like it, you like it. You don't like it, you don't like it.
So, sir, what you mentioned in that, just a question for us, I think, as law students, what skills do you recommend us to train upon or imbibe so that we can also contribute to this field of policy research? And with Vidhi, or like a lot of people looking for interning at Vidhi. So, as like young minds, what do you think are the best advice for us so that we can reach that platform and contribute to this arena?
See, the first is that, as I had said briefly to the boy who had come to take Nalin, I think he was Nalin, who had come to pick me up at NLU Jodhpur, is that you should set up a Kautilya Society at NLU Jodhpur, okay, which we have set up with 9 national law schools in the country. The idea is essentially to try and equip students in law and policy, both in terms of skill sets as well as in a few years in terms of jobs as well. So I strongly recommend that you do that. And if you write a mail following this to me, I will pass it on to the right person at Vidhi who can take this forward. Okay. Currently, actually, one of your alums is working with us on this. Swapnil Tripathi. So that's number one. Number two is that I think it's very important to be interdisciplinary as a law students. I think that a true legal education is an interdisciplinary one. You can be very good lawyers in terms of being able to interpret law well, but you have to understand society. So I think as law students, one is that it's critical. I mean, this is something we didn't do in our time, but it's critical to take all the so-called humanities and other subjects seriously. Okay, your economics and history and whatever in BA, LLB and whatever others. I think it's important to take it seriously because you have to have grounding in some areas other than law. That's number one. Number two is that build up your skill sets, particularly in terms of build up one additional skill set. So whether it is coding or it is public finance or what I would broadly call an allied area to the law. Okay. In some senses, if you like economics, go deeper into public finance. I mean, if you like tech, go deeper into coding. I mean, these are all allied areas which will be very critical for becoming good policy lawyers in the future. And yeah, and just remain curious and don't be too limited to the textbook and keep your grades up, but do the other stuff as well.
Thank you, sir. As much as it disheartens us, due to the paucity of time, we would have to now wrap this interview up. So
Right.
all our gratitude for you for joining this session. Vidhi is like the quintessential example of just putting your head down and getting to do the work. And I'm sure all of the readers at our blog will take the exact same inspiration from you and the insights that we publish. Lavanya, would you like to say something?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. It really means a lot. We actually have started the interview series with you being our first guest here. So thank you so much for making us for starting the series with us, and we look forward to any other collaborations and associations that we can have with you and with Vidhi in the future.
I'm very glad. Thank you. And it's a great initiative. And I wish you all the very best for this initiative and for everything else in your careers. All the best. So take care.